Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's session. We are very excited. This is normally something that Dr. Bradshaw has started, and she really worked hard to get a grant. And so Pillar College, in collaboration with OSHA, is sponsoring a webinar, Holding Space, Counseling Strategies for Navigating Grief and Loss. And it will be facilitated tonight by Reverend Dr. Jamie Edie Chisholm. And let me just tell you a little bit more about Dr. Jamie. She goes by Dr. Jamie. She's a multifaceted healer, dreamer, theologian. Please pronounce the next one.
Thanatologist.
Thank you, and traumatologist who plays a vital role in her community. Her work is dedicated to promoting healing and well-being, focusing on navigating trauma, loss, and grief. And she skillfully combines her commitment to justice and liberation with her expertise in thanatology and trauma and her educational guidance and care services. I can read on and on, but I do want to say I call Dr. Jamie a friend, a colleague, a sister, and a mentee. So I hope you know that you will embrace that. So welcome tonight, Dr. Jamie, to Pillar College.
Thank you so much, Dr. T. And I appreciate you saying a mentee. You all know I name you as a mentor, and sometimes you don't check in with people before you go places and you say who influences me, who's helped me grow, and I'm naming her. So I'm glad. So now I feel like I can go forward and do that, and you won't hear about it and be like, well, I didn't say that, but so that really feels good. I try to name people who I believe will be able to co-sign, like she's doing her work. And so thank you. And I'm glad to be here tonight for this conversation. And I hope to make it, I know it's just a couple of us in the room, but to make it as interactive as possible. So pause me if there are some questions that you need to ask. Let me share this screen. There we go. Oh, no. Oh, I didn't hit it right. Okay, there we go. Slideshow played from the beginning. So reading is fundamental sometimes, right? So holding space, counseling strategies for navigating grief and loss. And first I wanted to start by looking at this picture on the screen, right? So when we encounter loss, it always feels like a piece of us is taken away, right? I want you to think about your own life and the losses that you've experienced. It often feels like somebody's come in and sort of grabbed a piece of you and that it's missing. So I love looking at this particular image because this is how I think I have felt when I've encountered various kinds of losses. And when I talk to people, they feel like there's a hole in my heart. I don't feel the same. And so I think this is just a good image of what it looks like to navigate loss. And so why are we here? There are just a couple of things that I want to talk about tonight, right? I want us to develop a more expansive awareness of grief. I think that societally, we have a very limited understanding of what grief is. So I hope to expand that for us tonight. I want to identify some of the ways grief impacts the whole person. Because again, we tend to think that grief is just an emotional thing, right? It just impacts how you feel. You're sad, that's your grief, but it impacts us in so many more ways. And then finally, explore a few strategies, a few things that we can do with people as we are helping them navigate grief. But perhaps we might be able to take a couple of these things and apply them to our own experiences as we are navigating grief as well. So again, that picture, right? What loss has taken a piece of you away? What have you experienced in life? And I just want to name that even before I got on this Zoom, I went to Facebook. Now I try not to go to Facebook often. And the first thing that popped up for me was a notice that supervisor Cecilia Williams Bryant has transitioned this realm. And so in that moment, like a piece, like just, I didn't know her well. I had spent some time in her presence, but just that quickly, a little piece felt like it was pulled away. And so we are navigating life with losses, even as we support others who are navigating loss. So what is grief, right? I said grief is a little bit more expansive than people give it credit for. So first of all, grief is it is one of those life companions that maybe we did not invite, but we cannot escape. None of us is walking through life necessarily saying, hey, I want to lose something, take something from me. That's not how we approach it. But as we live, we most definitely will encounter loss. So grief is also an emotion, right? It's this complex emotion in response to loss, right? It might feel like sadness, might feel like anger, guilt, longing, grief, this feeling. But grief or grieving, mourning, right, is this process, and it's not a linear journey. So one of the things that I don't like talking about, and I hope this is not in any of your classes, or at least you have done some more expansive work around the 5 stages of grief, right? We talk about these 5 stages, but I hope that you don't limit yourself to understanding grief in 5 stages. Those 5 stages are very limited and do not encompass the fullness of our grief experience. So grief is this emotion, but it's also this process. It is this natural response to loss, change, and transition. And what does that mean? That means it's not just the death of a loved one. It's not just the Cecilia Williams Bryants of the world. It is maybe a job, maybe the ending of a relationship through separation or divorce or non-romantic relationship. You know, some of us have had friendships that have started to go in different directions, right? And it feels like you've experienced this loss. You are grieving this change. You are grieving this transition. And it could be a job. It could be, I share with people that a few years ago, my hair started falling out. And I was like, wait a minute. And I sank into sadness. And I'll tell you, y'all know I shaved my head before. So I was rocking a shaved head at one time in my life, one of those close cuts. But here it is. Grief came because this time I did not have agency in a decision, right? So think about that. It doesn't matter if you cut your hair off before and rock the close cut, rock the shaved head. This time, I couldn't choose it. Therefore, grief, right? So grief, emotion, process is natural. So no one can tell us. And we also, when we're supporting people, we need to know that this thing is normal, right? We don't treat them as if something is wrong with them because they are grieving, right? No timeline. Each of us might respond to our loss differently. So we said, what is that loss? Loss, death of a loved one. We said separation or divorce, loss of home or possessions, loss of sight or health, mobility, right? But let me do this for you. Those who are students, there is grief sometimes experienced in transitioning out of school. That you for 2 years, for 4 years, for 6 years, however long it takes you to go through your program, you got used to a routine. So you might be supporting someone who the grief, you might be like, well, that's not, you graduated. Hey, let's celebrate. But also, I now have to figure out how to navigate this life apart from a routine that I was used to, right? So that's, when you think about what loss is, that's what you can think of when it comes to loss. So I want to pause for just a second. We heard grief, natural response to loss. Loss is death-related and non-death-related losses. It's both an emotion and a process. It is not linear and it's not time-bound, right? So that means that 30 years ago, my grandmother transitioned this realm. And I'm fine today, but every now and then, I'll taste somebody's apple pie and it'll be close to my grandmother's, and I'll have memories, and sometimes a little bit of sadness awakens because it's not her pie, right? So I'm fine. I have reoriented myself to the world, but that taste of that pie, the smell of that pie awakens a memory. And so it's helpful for us to know, even as we're supporting people who are moving through this process, that a memory can awaken grief. So I just want to pause. What are you thinking? Are you, have you thought about in your own life how grief not only is experienced because someone is gone, but because something is gone. So I just want to pause. You can type it in the chat if you want, or say something about your own grief. Like, hey, I do notice that I have grieved some non-tangible things. I have had that experience.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandra. I'll go. Um, in my experience, I've lost a lot of loved ones,
Mhm.
but I think about 4, maybe almost 5 years ago is where I experienced spiritual grief, and I've never experienced that before. And I went through the whole process of, denial, the steps, but still I could not pinpoint. But it's because of the relationship I have with God, and the Holy Spirit is where the Holy Spirit told me that I was spiritually grieving. And there was, a situation that had occurred. And, being in, as counselors in training, it then hit me like, oh my goodness, I am grieving. I have went through denial. I have, because I remember saying, nah, not them. Like, so I went through that whole process. I was like, in depression. And so, yeah, I definitely experienced grief on a different level, because that was the first time I've ever experienced spiritual grief.
Right. So that's good that you said that. I want to take that for a second before we move to the next section, right? So we said grief is our natural response to loss, change, and transition. That could include a change in our understanding of how God works, who God is, how God will show up. And so, say I've been praying for God to do X and it hasn't happened. That might feel like a loss. It might feel like some distance, and that can bring grief in our life. And that would be classified in that space, sort of a spiritual loss, right? Like there's something spiritually, hey, God, you're not showing up. Hey, I thought you were going to do this. Y'all told me if I prayed about this thing, it would happen. And the way I look at it is our expectation is here and our reality is here. And therefore, there is some grief, right? Because we have this expectation or assumption about how God will be in the world, how others will be in the world, but that does not always meet our reality. And so, Sandra, as you said, then we might experience some existential or spiritual grief. So that's good. Thank you. I don't know, JB, if you wanted to add anything before I move. Not this time. Okay, that's all right. We got more. We got more. We got more. So I'm glad that you talked about this sort of spiritual grief or experiencing grief spiritually. When we think about the types of grief, we think about these are just some of the ways we look at how a person might experience grief. So anticipatory grief. This is grief that might come before the loss. So often if someone has a terminal illness, we start grieving now. We know Big Mama has cancer. We're grieving now, even though she's still with us, right? So the grief doesn't just start at the point of transition, that now that I know the loss is coming, I may be grieving. So that's that anticipatory grief. I'll tell you something, ambiguous grief. It's this grief that is unclear or lacks closure. And we talk about missing people, and you know how many missing Black and brown children there are in the world, and whose parents, the love is still here in their heart. Emotionally, they're still connected to their child, but their child is not home, right? So that's one way of ambiguous grief. I don't know, they're not here, but they're here. And I don't know for sure if they'll ever be back. Along with that, Dr. Pauline Boss, who she's one of the ones who sort of been coined that term and really did a lot of research on ambiguous grief. She talks about in one of her books a story of this married couple where the husband has Alzheimer's. So he doesn't recognize her, the wife, anymore. So he comes home, right there in the house together. They share a bedroom, but that's not her husband because she's not his wife, because he doesn't know her. Right? So I'm looking at you, I see you, but I also don't know you. And so she had to find ways to be supportive of him, even though she lost her husband. Her husband was no longer there. This man who was before her is someone different right now. And so how do you navigate when you don't have that closure, right? So anticipatory, ambiguous, disenfranchised. This is grief that's not socially recognized or supported. And you see a couple of things right there, non-traditional relationships. We talk about bodily autonomy, things like that, that it's not supported. This might also be something that yesterday, was it yesterday or Tuesday? I want to say Marcellus, Missouri.
Tuesday.
Yeah,
Tuesday.
Tuesday, right? So
Mhm.
disenfranchised grief is this. It is society saying this person does not deserve our grief or sadness because they were in jail. They were incarcerated. So society says people who are incarcerated, they don't deserve your compassion. They don't deserve they don't deserve your grief. So you don't really get to talk about it much because how dare you grieve someone who society has put away, right? Disenfranchised grief, cumulative grief. All of us have that where you just have multiple losses. And at some point you say, listen, I can't do this. This is too much for me. Collective, all of us, right? Tragedy. Think about COVID. Think about 2020 specifically and how we started seeing that death toll rise. 126,000, 312,000, got to 500,000. And you were like, it can't get to, got to 1 million, got to 1.2, right? This collective loss that all of us had this shared experience. We were all navigating grief together. Historical grief this is the kind of grief that, perhaps people of the African diaspora, folks who generationally, they've experienced tragedy and trauma. And now we are navigating the effects thereof, right? And so we can name the communities, our indigenous siblings, this might be something they experience. African Americans, this might be something they experience. And lots of other groups, right, that had this historical generational kind of grief that is passed down. And then secondary grief, and I think I have this. Yeah, this is it, secondary grief. So I want you to think for a moment about a loss you experience, right? And I'll do a scenario for us. So when my grandmother transitioned, I mentioned this is 30 years ago, right? My grandmother transitioned. Every Sunday at my grandmother's house, she had dinner. Every single Sunday. And she had a lot of siblings, but two sisters and one brother in particular came to her house every Sunday. So my grandmother's house, it was the grandparents, right? My grandmother, her two sisters, and her brother who came occasionally, but it was all their children. So that was my mother and all of the cousins that were at her level, right? Her generation, me and all my cousins. So every Sunday, my grandmother's house had at least 50 people in it. Every Sunday. One big family every Sunday, one big family dinner. When my grandmother transitioned, everybody went to their own house. So think about a secondary loss is, yes, your grandmother died, but guess what else died? The one family dinner. We became my aunt or my great aunt, my grand aunt, her sister, Josephine, their family went to their house and did dinner. Her sister, Darlene, their family went to their house and did dinner. And my mother, right, because her mother's not here, we had dinner at home. So what was a big dinner with 50 plus people became separate dinners. So a secondary loss is the ripple effect of the loss you experience. And so think about if you have a partner or a spouse that transitions and you both shared in the financial support of the family, you shared in the caring of the children, caring for the children. So the person is going, yes, that hurts. And wait a minute, I didn't used to wake the kids up. They woke the kids up. So the routine that the family had is missing. So secondary losses are the ripple effects of the loss. And what does that look like? Sometimes it could be lost opportunities, right? Sometimes it could be lost dreams. Because think about this. I work for an organization and we do work around homicide and violence, right? And so there are parents who their children are not here anymore. But guess what? Like most parents, you imagine a future for and with your child. So we have people who imagine their children finishing high school, maybe going to college, maybe getting married and having children. So this lost dream is my child is not here, but I also have to reckon with that I am losing a dream that I had about the life I would live with my child in the future. Right? You all are with me, right? This lost dream, financial losses. Let's be clear. Let's be clear. Grief can cost us financially too. Absolutely. If you had a shared financial responsibility with someone for your household and this person is gone, where that other 60, 70, 50, 40, 30, where that other money gonna come from? What about the medical bills? Now y'all sending this to my house, to the family of. Now I have these medical, there are things that disrupt, that change our capacity for living in our now, our lifestyle. Secondary losses, and then changing in our roles, as we said, right? I am now the primary caregiver for the family, right? So anytime you are working with someone, what I listen for when people talk to me, they talk about losses, I listen for what else, there's like some fly, I listen for what else might be associated with the thing they just mentioned, right? I listen for the person who just transitioned. I wonder if that was their biggest cheerleader, right? Because now it's not just that auntie is gone, but when my mama said I couldn't do something, auntie said, baby girl, you can do it, right? So secondary losses, really critical. And even helping people, sometimes I do a chart with people and I have them name some of the things that have changed or will change in their life as a result of this loss, because it's helpful for us to be able to sort of just look at it for a second. Let me just sit with the full magnitude of my experience. So my partner is gone. So I no longer have a sense of safety and security like I did when my partner was here. I also don't have anyone to share in the responsibility of helping me bring these children and rear these children in this world. I also don't have my talk, you got your cut buddy, your talk partner. I don't have the person who I can share with about my day at work. I don't have the person that I could complain to so I can then go back to the place and do well. I don't have the person who supported my dreams. That's a lot of losses, even though it's one person that's gone. So giving people the fullness of their grief experience by not minimizing it. We can't minimize your loss and we can't minimize their loss, right? So these secondary losses. Now, when we think about how grief impacts us our whole, we said our whole person. So there's a physical impact of grief, right? J. William Worden talks about, he's not the first person, but he talks about these 4 areas where when you first experience a loss, these 4 areas are kind of the ways that people experience them. One is through their emotions. So we know what the emotions are, various emotions, including relief. Let's name relief. Sometimes relief is that emotion. But he talks about these thoughts. So sometimes our thoughts we become preoccupied, right? Just can't fixate it on the person, can't get our mind off of them, right? We talk about the behaviors. So some of you might sleep all day once you experience a loss, because grief takes a lot of energy. You might sleep all day. Maybe you can't sleep at all. Some of you might not have an appetite, or you might be like me and I just want sugar, 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 right? I discovered Insomnia Cookies delivers warm cookies at midnight because I was grieving. I was like, wow, right? So some of us, we're eating a lot, others have no appetite. And sometimes you go back and forth between the two, right? So he talks about these feelings, these thoughts, these behaviors, and this way that it impacts our bodies. So it might feel like you have like your stomach, just an upset stomach. You might feel a tightness in your throat or in your chest, right? And so it's knowing that it's impacting the whole person. And then when we think about dimensions of wellness, there are about 8 or 9 dimensions of wellness that we talk about, including environmental, that's outdoors, what's happening in the world, intellectual, but these 4 in particular, when we think about grief, your physical wellness, disrupting your sleep, your appetite, your energy levels, physical symptoms, aches in your body, right? Significantly fatigued, weakened immune system. So now you're getting the cold. You don't never catch colds. Now you're catching a cold, right? As your body processes this emotional weight of the loss. your whole, you metabolize, and this is not in the bad sense, but your whole self experiences the loss. So physical wellness, emotional wellness, right? The feeling, sadness, anger, we talked about that a little bit. Spiritual wellness can shake our belief or deepen our search for meaning. And sometimes what it does is it shakes us first, which forces us to dig deeper, right? Like, because God, I thought this was, and you learn maybe God is bigger than what I thought. Maybe God is bigger than what I thought. Maybe it's, oh, okay, right? So spiritual and then social. When we experience grief, it impacts our relationships. Many of us isolate ourselves, and I get it. For moments, that isolation feels safe, right? We have to learn how to have language and ritual so that we don't feel like we have to remain isolated in our loss. And we know when to go get people who are grieving so that they know they're not alone. So grief impacts these four particular dimensions in a really, really significant way. All right. So I'm gonna pause. Any questions right now? I'm honoring our time and that you all have an exam that we are believing you are going to do extremely well on tonight. So any questions? I will give us some time to talk through or ask questions at the end as well. But so one of the things that we talk about is, sometimes we treat grief like it's a weakness. We've been socialized not to feel, right? We know, and we can talk about the history of that, right? Of not being numb to our feelings, being numb to being embodied, like being in your body. I just attended something last week in Brooklyn, the Ma'afa at St. Paul Community Baptist Church, and Cole Arthur Riley, the author of Black Liturgies and This Here Flesh, books you can add for your own sort of reflection time, right? She said, if you are not in your body, somebody else is, right? Like if you are not, when we are not embodied, fully being in ourselves, then somebody else is controlling it, right? Like, so it could be that your job is in your body and it's dictating that you're gonna work yourself, right? That you're gonna stay on this hamster wheel and just work and never give yourself rest, right? So being embodied means that we have to know that grief is not a weakness, that we can't shame people because they're grieving. It's not a weakness. It is expressing in fact, I think expressing your grief and allowing yourself to experience and express your grief might be a strength, right? Knowing when to. So let's be clear. This is not to shame our great-grandparents for having to do what they needed to do to survive. Right? They knew that they could not cry because they knew that they also could not be angry because that would warrant punishment. And so they understood what it meant to just hum and go, that they knew what it meant to just hum and go about their business because it ensured their survival. What I'm saying to us is that we are invited to recognize that what grandmama had to do to survive, we can learn from and maybe do something else as well, right? I never saw my grandmother cry. I didn't realize that until a couple of years ago. Like, I never saw my grandmother cry. But I'm grateful that I now cry, and I recognize the strength that it took for her to show up in the world and be safe and ensure that her kids were safe, right? So what does it take for us to see grief not as a weakness, right? But as a human experience that we all deserve when we experience a loss, right? So I deserve the space to grieve. So grief is not a weakness. What else is grief not? Grief is not orderly. So this is when I talk about those stages of grief that we all learn, right? That when we see that as a linear process, it can box us in because you might think I'm no longer depressed. And then you find yourself like, wait a minute, I feel depressed again. Did I move backwards in the process? Am I not doing well? No, it's not a linear process. It looks more like zigzag. You move from different emotion and different feeling. And so It's not orderly. It's messy, right? It can be unpredictable. You can be at your desk doing something, and all of a sudden, the image flies across your face and your warm tears start falling down your face. Just random, right? 5:35 p.m., random tears falling. Thought you were good today. Guess what? You are good today. Those tears are good too, right? And it's not predictable. So understanding this kind of grief experience can be helpful for us and for the people that we support. So I want to take a pause again. You know, I said I'm going to just take some pauses and do a temperature check, right? So, oh, I see it. I see some of the comments that we learned, right? Some things that we learned, right? Numb to our feelings, especially in the church world. Yeah, in the church world, we're doing better. Let's give it up for those faith communities. I didn't even think about Dr. T and let's give it up for the communities that recognize that we are whole beings and that we feel. We are not robots, we feel. And so what does it mean to allow you to understand and process your feelings without shaming you or causing you to question your faith? Sometimes that's where the grief comes from. It's because I'm questioning my faith because I have these feelings. And so, yeah, culturally, numb to our feelings, stay in a child's place, things that we learned from, right. So there's a story in this book. It is called The Politics of Trauma, I believe. And they tell the story about, and I'm saying this because sometimes we teach our children how not to feel, right? And I get it. It's really done because we learn how to survive in the world by not drawing attention to ourselves, by not making folks afraid of us, right? So what does that mean to stay safe? And so they tell the story about how a woman is walking her children. She has maybe one in the stroller and maybe one is holding her hand and they're walking down the street. They're all crossing the street together. This car kind of loses a little bit of control and it scares everybody. Everybody's safe. So everybody kind of, gets pushed out the way. So now they're crying. Well, the little boy is crying. Mom picks him up and says, "Stop that crying." Now, listen, can y'all picture it? The car just kind of lost control, got real close to hitting people. Somebody pushed folks out the way. I'm scared. I'm crying, right? Stop that crying. Because we've been taught that you show you can take it, right? And showing I can take it means I don't show emotion. We teach our children that. And again, we're not shaming our grandparents. We're recognizing the why behind what they did and asking ourselves, can we do something different, right? Can we do something different? All right, so got a little bit more time left. But let's talk about this in ways that this is where we can incorporate maybe our spirituality and our uniqueness, right? So a helpful metaphor around grief. Thinking of grief as this psycho-spiritual trauma. And just like a physical wound on the body, right? So it's a wound. It needs to be tended to carefully through the process of mourning, grieving, right? Allowing ourselves to go through the process so that we facilitate healing and prevent infection. Now, you might say, what do you mean prevent infection from grief? Infection might look like, I have isolated myself from all healthy relationships. And even though I've been 6 months in this process, I am still completely isolated. It might look like I am growing bitter because I am so angry at this loss I've experienced. I can't get out of it, right? I cannot adjust to the world because part of this grieving process is I acknowledge that I've had a loss. I allow myself to process the pain of the loss, which takes time. I then figure out how to reorient myself to the world. Because guess what? This is the hard part with people. Life's still happening, right? Our children still need to eat. They still need to, get up for breakfast and go to bed. They still, right? The lights still need to be paid. I can't just say, hey, I'm grieving, keep my lights on. No, so life is still happening, but I can get stuck. Even though grief has no timeline, I can still get stuck. It's messy like that, right? So this metaphor is, how do I tend to the wound? What are some of the ways that I can tend to the wound so that I can reorient myself to the world? And I have this other description of grief that I like to use. We're going to get into that in a second. And I see you in here saying suppressing grief as if our emotions, right, are weaknesses. We are whole beings, but we learn lessons of what it means to express emotion. And we've seen people punished for it. And so what do? We find a way to survive. That's definitely something we've had to do. So here's my perspective. Here's my perspective. Grief is not just an experience of loss. It is an invitation to reimagine. It's an opportunity to reorient ourselves and trust that God is continuously remaking and reshaping us. In our grief, we are called to join God in creating harmony in ourselves and in the world, which might look like doing justice, loving mercy. I know y'all know that scripture, right? And walking humbly with God. Through this lens, grief becomes a space for transformation, inviting us into deeper relationships with ourselves, with each other, and with the divine. What am I saying? Loss is inevitable. Change is inevitable. Transition is inevitable. So what does that mean? That means that that's part of my life. Right? That from the moment I take my first breath to my last breath, I am engaging in losses, changes, and transitions. So now that I know that loss is an inevitable part of my life's journey, it is a companion. It's a constant companion. How do I consider grief, this process, as something that God can use to continue to reshape me so that I can be present in my today? So I want you all, right? We might not answer that tonight. I want you to think about that though. What is it about this experience? Now, let me tell you, I told you I do homicide grief work here in the city of Philadelphia. I'm not saying that any mother, any parent, any sibling deserves to experience that kind of loss. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying that loss is inevitable, right? I'm saying that these are the things that happen in the world where people are. Now that it's happened, how do I not get stuck in my yesterday because I'm still here? How do I reimagine a future for myself and maybe even my loved ones? But let's stay with self for a minute, right? Because it's easy. We know it. It's easy to stay in our yesterday when we've experienced a loss. Our world is shaken upside down. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to know anybody new. I don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to show up for anything. I don't want to. And in some ways, regardless of, say, faith tradition, right? There is a thought about the divine being with you always. That means that my identity in relationship to the person, the place, the thing that is no longer here physically, that I now have to find a new way to imagine myself in the world so that I can continue moving forward in the world. That is the spiritual call. That's the existential call. That's the perspective of grief that allows us to believe that God is not finished with us, even though something was taken from us. That because I've experienced one loss does not mean that all is lost, right? So I want to pause there for a second. Tell me what you all are thinking or feeling about how you might be able to reorient yourself to seeing grief as an opportunity to reimagine you and God in your present and future. What comes to mind when you hear that? I don't know, JB, you weren't talking to us, were you?
Yeah, that's what I was getting ready to ask. What she said, talk to us. Of course, I see you, JB. Okay, gotcha.
Anybody want to share? Anybody, and you can type it in the chat too. But what does that feel? What does that feel like? Grief as a invitation to be reshaped and remade. God continuously working on you. What does that, when you hear it that way, what does that feel like for you?
I feel like it's the silver lining in grief. I feel like it's taking a negative situation and kind of focusing on the positive versus the loss. Because when you focus on the loss, that's all you really think about. You know, you don't think about, okay, with this loss, what can I do with it? How can I move forward? What now? How can I grow from it? You know what I'm saying? So that's, to me, that's the silver lining in grief. Of course, we don't want to think about that when we're grieving. That's the last thing we want to think about. We just want to, sometimes we're just stuck there. But if we're going to reimagine our lives, I mean, it's the truth. Like, we don't have this particular, it could be person anymore. You know what I'm saying? So now, okay, what does my life look like without this person? It doesn't always have to be negative. You can take positivity from it. Hey, I don't have my dad here, but I know he would want me to do this. I know this would make him happy. I know he would be extremely proud that I'm about to graduate. You know, things like that. Like, try to kind of refocus on the positives in your life versus kind of dwelling on the loss, even though it comes in stages and waves and you're going to be up and down, around the corner with it. But at least you can find something to kind of refocus back to. So that's what I think.
Yeah, thank you for that, because, and I, you know, sometimes thinking of silver lining can feel forced, right? Right. And so let's be clear, because I this is not a forcing ourselves into this space. This is a, how do I get underneath, like in my bones, and understanding that a sense of what it means, what impermanence means, right? How these are the wisdom, the ancestral wisdom lessons, right? That the folks you see today are not always going to be walking with you. Now, the pain of that, we need to be able to experience fully. So the duality of this hurt, and who am I now? What do I do now? I like someone wrote something about purpose in the chat. When one of the things that I have learned to do is to understand exactly what my purpose is, so that regardless of the job I have, I know who I like. So if I'm answering the phones, then I'm a healer who's answering the phones, right? If I'm baking cookies, I'm the healer who bakes cookies. I know who I am, and then I can be that in all those spaces. So when something is taken from me, right, say I lose a job, then my purpose is intact, because that's who I am. And so how do we start to see life as this opportunity we have, maybe to bear children, maybe to have parents, engage in relationships, with the understanding that none of that in this form is permanent in this form, right? And so, yeah, I like that you said this, it's this silver lining, and let me have my anger and frustration too, right? I need to be able to have both of those. The thing that moves me forward, though, with a sense of peace and well-being and harmony, I think someone wrote in the chat earlier about how we can have disharmony in our body, right? When I am stuck in some ways, the loss, the pain of the loss, that can start to take up residence in my body. So how do I really see grief? Yeah, this thing hurt. And I got to go through my process. But I also know that in this, yeah, nobody wanted to say goodbye to Michael. But we learned so much from Michael, right? That idea, not forcing it on people. So thank you for naming that, JB. I can do one more person before we get to just the last couple of slides. Anybody else want to add how it, when you think about grief as this invitation to reimagine?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I truly enjoyed the way that you worded it, the reimagining, and from the brain injury, so to speak, of the traumatic experiences, especially when there are multiple deaths back to back to back.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, the purpose, I enjoy that portion of it too. Redefining what my purpose, redefining my identity, but redefining it in Christ, in God. Because my sole purpose to be here is to worship him and encounter him. And the only way we can get closer to him is not that God will kill people out your life so you can get closer to him, but it doesn't happen to life, it happens in life. And it's those seasons where my faith is more so catapulted to another level of trusting the one who created me, understanding that everything he's done for me, everything he's allowed in my life, is to bring me closer to him and that he might receive the glory. Understanding also, redefining what everything we go through is not about us. You know, when you look at the bigger picture, he took on something that was not owed to him. And that fellowshipping in his sufferings, we don't know how it's going to come about, but he said, if any man lose his life, he shall save it. But if any man desires to save his life, he shall lose it. And grief, like you said, it's not always just the loss of a loved one physically leaving. They could go to California, you know, just the mere, what did they represent to me?
Right.
And
right.
And I get that out of dreams a lot. You know, I heard people say, well, you dream about your dead grandmother, dream about your dead cousin. And it's like, well, that means, what it really means is, who do they represent to me? What did they represent to me? You know,
yeah.
And understanding that there is someone who will never leave me nor forsake me. And he gave me an entire book of Lamentations to let me know that it's okay. It's okay
yeah.
to take a break, that and showing me that there are layers to our life, that things could not be broken off, or things we couldn't tap into if we had not had this experience of life and this grief process.
Yeah, and let me stay right there with what you just named, right? So this idea that we do not wish ill will on anyone. My faith, my theology does not say that God is out here taking folks from us, right? And I believe that everybody on here is like, God ain't out here that folks are doing things, right? And our faith also tells us that there is no experience that we go through where God is not also present with us. And so finding the strength to move through the losses, because we know that, yeah, I'm mad right now, I'm hurting right now, and I am also not alone in this, can be helpful. So we got a few minutes left. I want to do this. What it means to hold space. So often we talk about holding space for people, right? I want to hold space. I want to do. So this idea that there is a safe, non-judgmental, empathetic environment where folks can explore. Here's what that means. Explore means I don't have all the answers. So when a person, if I'm holding space for somebody, I'm not holding space to fix it. I'm not holding space to provide them with all the answers. That's not what we are here for. It is, I am opening space, safe, non-judgmental, my whole presence and attention, empathetic environment, so we can explore your thoughts, your feelings, and your experiences. I am fully present. I am listening without interruption as much as possible, right? And so thinking about, if we think about some strategies, I want to give you a few strategies, and I'll share these slides so you can keep playing around with them. But right, we talked about compassionate presence, we talked about normalizing the grief experience, because it ain't strange. Like, this is a human part of our experience. And folks who biblically try to shame you because you are crying or you are sad, right? Then we just talked about this book of Lamentations, right? This idea of lament is biblical. And so to move through life without the invitation to lament is really antithetical to the biblical witness. So you can point right back to the word and say, yeah, I'm allowed to cry. I'm allowed to lament. I'm allowed to say, God, why me? Why? I'm allowed to say that, right? And it should also contain some cultural competence, right? There are some things you might need to say to a Black woman that you don't say to a white man, like knowing the difference in how we show up for people. And then somatic awareness, knowing that grief does impact our bodies. So here are some R's that I do with people when we talk about the process of remembering. The first step is, well, and you may not do them in this order, but this is this step. So reflection, the importance of being able to pause and name, because so often people they got to get back to work. They got to get back to the thing. They're back at it. And they don't get the space to just say, here's my loss. Remember I said, sometimes you got to name the loss and look at some of the secondary losses that are associated with it. That matters, right? That's how you can validate somebody's experience, by giving them a chance to share it. Reconnection. What does it look like to be in tune, in touch with their emotions, right? So I use a feelings wheel when I work with people. And I'm always like, do I have a wheel real quick? I think I might have a small wheel. Yes. This little tiny wheel, right? This little tiny wheel. I keep my little feelings wheel. This is a small one, but I keep a feelings wheel just because sometimes people need help with naming some of their feelings. They're like, oh, I'm angry and sad and this. So what does it look like to reconnect to your emotional self? Release. This is society, culturally, we have learned some expectations around grief that are harmful. You can't cry, boys don't cry, toughen up, all that kind of stuff. We need to be able to release those harmful ideologies that we hold on to. Relief, the body keeps the score. So what does it mean for you to have relief in your body? That could be drinking water, it could be trying to find a way to rest, could be going back out into nature. So what can you do to find some relief in your body? Then rewinding. Some of us have had grief experiences as children that we haven't quite fully processed. And so sometimes in this journey, you are processing today's loss, but you're also revisiting the loss from when you were 13 that you might also need to have some care and processing around. Rediscovery. We often lose a sense of our identity with the loss. You stop doing the things you enjoyed. You stop going and being in the places you enjoyed. At some point, we have to invite people to rediscover themselves and their identity. Yes, not apart from spirit, not apart from God, but who I am today. And ritual. What are these life-giving activities that honor me and my loved one as I move forward in life? I can engage in ritual, and it can be a great way to find meaning in my present, even though my loved one is not with me. And then I'll just put that quote back up there again about grief. So it'll be twice in your, and just something about me, just in case you need to get in touch with me. I know we only have another minute or so, but are there any questions that I might be able to answer before you all go and take your exam? Okay. Well, good. I hope you all found this helpful. The slides will be shared so you can continue to practice and think about this a little bit more. Dr. T, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jamie. This was just very helpful. I'm going through my own grieving process, transitioning from this idea of being a full-time faculty member to a new identity in my career. So as you were going through this, I was just reminding myself that I'm just trying to normalize it, that the feelings I'm having are normal feelings to go with the process. So thank you.
Yeah.
I'm thankful, JB, Sandra, Windland, Talika for coming tonight. We'll have a part B. But I'm gonna, Dr. Bradshaw wants me to make sure we do an evaluation. So it's anonymous. So I am going to get this evaluation started. If you could, why isn't it loud? There we go, launch. Should take you just a few minutes. It's anonymous. I hope you can do it, because I know a couple of you are on your phones. Is it allowing you to answer the questions? Okay.
Perfect, perfect, perfect.
Thank you, Dr. Jamie. This is excellent.
Good. Yeah, I hope everyone can just find one way, one thing that you might do differently for yourself. And then as you consider the people you're supporting, right, what might be a way that you can show up for them as well. So I hope this was helpful. Seeing testimonies.
And Brianne was here, but she said she
Yeah.
had to get set up for her class. So
Okay.
she said thank you.
Is it Woodland? Is that how it's pronounced? Yeah, you see, I see it. I've never seen my grandmother or father, right? Like, I
Nope.
never saw them. Yeah.
So what are those around us modeling and how to manage the emotions, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it just takes one of us to start trying to do something different and
Yeah,
inviting others, and right, let me normalize this for me, and then I might be able to go and help you normalize
right.
tears as okay.
Yep.
Yes, what I was thinking as you were talking earlier, I had two thoughts. So one, Professor Tinsley alluded to, like, grief isn't just the dying of someone; it can be any other thing in your in the chapter that you're in life. So I feel like I'm experiencing that as well in a different realm. But then I was thinking about a pastor of mine who currently is, when you see it coming, like, it's coming. So he's going through prostate cancer. And so 2 Sundays ago, so he's been missing for a couple of months, going through chemo and everything. And so he came 2 weeks ago and he actually preached. When I tell you, I cried because you see the weight loss, you see it, and he preached, but high key, he was saying goodbye.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I spoke to a couple of other church members who watched the sermon, and we all were like, is it just me? Or he was literally saying his last goodbyes. But he's also that pastor who's very in tune with, like, reality. So he's always spoke about, don't cry for me at my funeral. Like, don't even buy me a cat. Just burn the body, because the body don't matter anymore. It's your soul, it's your spirit, it's who you were and what you left behind. And even during this process, he's explaining how I'm not upset at God and I'm looking forward to glory. I feel more sorry for you guys on earth than me, like right now, yeah, you're going through the pain and everything, but I understand it as being temporary. So he's very, like, lighthearted about it, and him understanding it, what he's going through, and helping us to understand, like,
It's
you're
healthy.
gonna be okay. Yeah, it helps a lot. So I'm like,
Very healthy. And so what I
thank
want
you.
you to do is, in the earlier slides, I'm gonna send this out. We talk about grief just like not just being death. And it sounds like this pastor is very healthy, but I know y'all gotta go. I'm not trying to keep y'all from doing well on this exam. And so Thank you, Dr. T. I see you just got the survey results, and
Yeah,
so
Thank you. Thank you all. Good luck tonight. I'll see my
Yes.
class, October 8th. Thank you, Talika, for coming. You are an alum. We'll invite you for some other events as well. All right. Thank you,
Please
Doctor.
do. Thank you.
I'll talk to you
Thank
soon.
you. Good night.
take care, everybody.